Okay, in this topic, we're going to be talking about how to protect your privacy and as it relates to data owners, data processors, data remnants, and collection limitations. Okay, so in this objective of data owners, some key things you need to consider: who are the data owners for your organization? And some key factors you really need to consider as you are determining that. In all honesty, if you just determine this ahead of time, it's going to go dramatically well for you and your organization, depending upon what you're doing. So as from the CISSP standpoint, if you are looking at this as the head of security for your organization, you need to focus on this specifically. And they're going to come back a lot of the times and people are going to say, well, IT owns it. You cannot do that. You have to come back and pick out a specific data owner for your organization. And this is the person who's ultimately responsible within an organization for the data. Now, it can be numerous people. It can be one person, depending upon the size of the company and the data that you're trying to protect. However, you have to pick somebody who is responsible ultimately for it. And typically, this can be the CEO of the company. It could be the president or department head. And I've seen it where in the case of R&D is responsible for the data. And then also I've seen it as well as the CEO is ultimately responsible. So the CEO will delegate that capability down to the R&D folks or within a department location. However, at the end of the day, the buck stops with the CEO and they'll be the ones that'll be held accountable for it. Different data requires different data owners, and it may not just be one person, as I kind of alluded to earlier. You may have a folder or a SharePoint site, for example, that may be collecting data, and that one location, there might be multiple owners for that one location because they don't have the decision rights. One person may not have the ultimate decision rights for that SharePoint site. So they may just, you got to consider that. Who is the actual data owner for the individual site? You also got to consider who may be liable for negligence if they fail to perform this. Now, I've seen it from a security officer standpoint where you may be liable for the protection of your environment, especially if you put in compensating controls. Well, the data owner will be potentially liable for negligence if they fail to perform their duties in this role. And that's resulted in enforcing policies within an organization and everything that goes along with that. So as it relates to guidance for these data owners, NIST 818 is a great guide for developing a security plan within your organization. And it was designed for the federal government, and so therefore it's a good place to start. Now, you need to look at it from your organization to ask yourself, do you need that level of security and that level of detail? Because the government will go to excruciating detail in some of these things. So you got to decide from your risk-based approach what is the best for your organization. As a data owner, it has a rules for appropriate use, and from seeing this personally and professionally, you need to set this up as well for if you have intellectual property, and there needs to be rules and guidance around its appropriate use. If you have individuals that you are within your team that are responsible for intellectual property, one of the key things that they always think about is the hard copy version. They don't think very often about the data version. Well, that you need to make sure that you incorporate that into your plan. Now, 818 will provide guidance around security controls and requirements, and it helps give you a framework to work from. It also helps you decide the privileges and access rights for the data itself. And it gives you a good litmus test to go down and decide what is best for your organization around acceptable use or any other behaviors that may be around the specific data. So again, it's a good way for you to get started. So the asset owner or business owner, they are the ones that you develop your security plan in coordination with them. So the data owner owns it ultimately, but the asset owner or the business owner will then work with the data owner to determine what is the best course of action to protect the data. Now, I say all this, you also need, as security people, you need to be actively engaged in this. Do not just let these people go off on their own. Do not go and just say, here's a guide, go figure it out. You need to be actively engaged and involved when you're working through this plan with them, because they understand their data, but they don't understand the overall security, and they will forget things because I forget things and I'm running security. So you need to understand that. And a specific asset, that'll also, when you break down your asset owners and your business owners, you'll get it with a specific asset access to sensitive data. So what asset has access to the sensitive data? So let's put as an example. You have a system, and this system by itself is connected. It it may be sensitive, but it connects to a lot of other systems that are sensitive. We had an application that would connect to a database that was very, very important. Well, I had to work with the data owner and to understand the application. So I also had to work with the asset owner to determine they own the asset, how to protect the data on the asset, also how to protect the data within the database. So there's like 4 different people or 4 different groups of individuals I had to work with just to protect one application with one database. You also need to ensure the system is updated and properly configured. A good example of this is a digital marketing team. Your websites may be populated with a back-end database, but okay, so the CMS, the content management system that's in charge of all that, is the front end. But you may have websites that have a back end that have to be updated and populated as well. And also you have to protect those databases. How do you best do that? So all of those pieces, you need to look at all the assets from beginning to end. The business owner will manage these systems. So like in my case, I manage the digital marketing aspects for our organization, but I'm not the data owner around that. There's 3 different people that I would have to work with around specifically who is the data owner, depending upon the business that needs the information. So again, asset owner owns the asset, data owner owns the data, and you need to really get with everybody together when you're working through data protection. Now, data processors, what are these people? The context is everything as it relates to processing data, and you need to think about, was it system data? Is it data about individuals? So the system data is the data that maybe is from your application that's creating, supply chain documents, right? Or is it the individuals that are located within SAP? So you need to understand the differences. Now, GDPR data processor, which they mention in GDPR, is a natural legal person, public authority, agency, or other body which processes personal data solely on the behalf of the other data controller. And so that's a data processor. So now that data processor is very different than a data processor that you may have within your organization. Now in this case here, the data controller collects personal data for employees for finance and then passes that information to the data processor, which is a third party. So these people, these data processors, as it relates to GDPR, they are focused on, they take the data, they collect the data, and they then move the data on. And so as you're passing information to these data processors through GDPR, you must be aware of what protections are in place around them and also defining who they are specifically. A good example of a data processor within the GDPR realm would be your finance. So in many cases, companies will outsource part of their finance to a third party. This would be a data processor who would collect data on these individuals, but you're forcing it on or passing it on to somebody else. Now, the compliance around GDPR, we talked about this before, but it's 4% of your global revenue, which on a $1 billion company, that's a $40 million fine for not doing what you're supposed to be doing. Now, the EU and the U.S. Privacy Shield, that used to be so basically it moved from Safe Harbor to U.S. Privacy Shield. Now it's GDPR. And what had happened in the past was, and I remember this was Safe Harbor, you would self-certify them that you are meeting and complying with the Privacy Shield requirements. Now, that piece of this it used to be it was a self-certification, and there were some level of fines that were involved, but nothing to the level of GDPR. So this is extremely important that you focus on what a data processor is, and also how that you're going to manage the data within, especially as it relates to GDPR. Other key GDPR terms that you need to be aware of is, I don't even know how to say that word, but it's a process for using pseudonyms, okay, to represent the data. Now, as an example, it's kind of an anonymization aspect of this. Bill Smith is patient 12345. So now there is a database that will corroborate who Bill Smith is and as it relates to patient 12345. And it works really well, and it's very popular for obfuscating data. Then there's anonymizations, process of removing all relevant data about the person or identity. So in the case of Bill Smith, you have patient 12345. In the case of this other one, you can go ahead and have it changes the name. So like if you go in the case of this, Bill Smith with the social of 123456789 is now Jennifer Smith at 987654321. That you got to have. Then you have to have again the Rosetta Stone to translate between Bill Smith and Jennifer Smith. However, the output is that it's anonymized. It's not the same person anymore. The point of it still comes back to the Rosetta Stone still exists. They force you to do this so that when the data comes back, especially as the United States, it's not tied to an individual person. It is random gobbledygook or something else. So you got to think about that as well. Now, as we get into the objective of data remnants, what is that? Well, that is what the data is left after it has been erased. So when you wipe a disk and there should be no information on it, the typical erasing thing, all it does is when you erase a disk is the pointers that point back to where your data was at is gone. It's erased. So now there's no way for the system to go back and find your data. However, the data is still resident on the disk itself. So therefore, there is residual data. Even if you do various formatting, there is some of that. So you have to take some extra steps to make sure that the data is not there. It's an extremely big problem, especially as it relates to printers, copiers, those kind of things, where in many cases they have hard drives that are associated with the systems themselves. And so therefore, the data still resides within them. I've seen situations where they've had printers that were shipped to overseas locations because they are end of life. Well, people forgot to take out the hard drives, and then there was all kinds of data that was sitting inside those hard drives that were associated with those printers or copiers. So it's a big deal from data leakage and data loss perspective. The other thing is ghost images on computers. So your RAM, as they've proven it time and time again, that RAM within a system will contain data. And so therefore, when there's resident data within it, that if you don't purge the RAM, especially if you're getting rid of systems, you could run the risk of having some data that's left with a computer system that's given away. So again, those are things to consider around data remnants. Now, do most companies have to worry about the ghost image on RAM? Most likely not. However, again, you got to go work back to your data owner and determine how important is the data for your organization. Now, there's a process to remove this media, and there's different ways of doing it. Degaussing, physical destruction, erasing, clearing, and purging are the key ones that people utilize. Now, the degaussing aspect of this is basically it uses powerful magnets to destroy the typical magnetic drive. So these are monster magnets that basically just they fry it. They erase all the magnetic aspects of it. The ones and zeros are just erased to nothing. Once you hit it, it's not like though once you go through degausser, oh okay, everything's back to good. It's like a brand new drive. No, once you degauss it, it's done. That thing's toast. You can't use it anymore. The other one is putting these hard drives in like a meat grinder, except it's like super jaws of death that will chew up your hard drives. And these can be run through high-powered shredders that just basically destroy everything. I highly recommend this. In the past, it used to be you could hit a physical drive with a hammer, and that would shatter the glass plates that it's on, solid state or with physical drives. Solid state drives, you can't do that. I highly recommend you just shred these things. You destroy them because data will reside on those chips. But you need to run it through that thing. Now, a regular meat grinder won't do as well as these industrial strength ones, right? When you're erasing something, you need to delete the operation of the file or the field type. But again, it only removes the pointer of the file location, not the data itself. Clearing will overwrite process for media to be reused. It ensures it can't be recovered. So that's basically you write a character over the entire disk. So we've done this in the military. You would run this clearing process and it would overwrite data over the top of every part of the hard drive. So instead of if it had 100, whatever, it would just go 111, all would be ones, single character, are all zeros, right? So again, that's clearing. Now purging is, instead of just doing it once, the purging may do, you have a regulation or compliance requirement that says you got to do it 7 or 8 times. So you're doing it multiple times. The government used to do that a lot, where if you were purging out a system that was classified systems would always get shredded. But if it was an unclassified, just basically means you're just doing normal work. There is a process of cleaning up those drives if you're putting them back out into the world. The other one is collection limitations. Now, this happens with transborder flows of personal data. Now, in the past of this is that there's key provisions that have been set up within the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. Yes, it is alphabet soup, OECD. And this was issued in 1980, and then what it did was any personal data that was leaving had to go through this process, which then flowed into GDPR, well, I should say safe harbor and so forth, on any data that was leaving an organization that was in the EU going to another country had to go through cross-border data analysis. And so those are things that you had to deal with. And there was 30 member nations, including the United States, that signed up for this economic cooperation and development. Now, there was 8 driving principles. There was collection limitations, which basically means you should reduce the amount of collection of data on individuals as much as possible. And it has to be obtained in a fair and legal way. So that's the collection limitations around that. You can't go out and just go, hey, I got a hard drive, I'm just going to take stuff and then ship it across the border. You can't do that. They're trying to hold to some level of due diligence around that. The quality must be kept complete. You can't be parsing it up and putting it in pieces from a data quality standpoint, and it's got to be consistent with the purpose it's being used for. So if I'm taking personal data about finance and I'm sending it to a finance controller in the United States, that makes sense. If I am taking personal data about finance and I'm shipping it for shipping data, but I'm just going, you know what, we're just going to ship it all over there, not just the shipping data. That's not good. So that's not for what the purpose it was supposed to be used for. That's under data quality. The other one is purpose specification. You need to give a notification to the individual about the collection and why you're doing it, and also the time of collected and what was its purpose. Now, in many of those cases, that's the paper that people sign when they join an organization that's been allocated out, saying they have the right to do this as needed for normal work capability. However, if a person comes back and says, well, I want to know where you're sending my data, they have the right to do that, and you therefore need to tell them what you did, where to go, and why you did it. And the other thing, a use limitation, was the consent of the person and the law authority to disclose the data. So if you want to disclose anything, you have to have consent from the person and from the law enforcement representatives to disclose the data, especially if the data has purposes stated differently than what you had planned on disclosing to them. So if you told them I'm sending finance data, but now you're going to go, yeah, you know what, we're going to send your personal information data as well. We're going to disclose that to these regulators. You have to let people know that you're going to do that. You can't just go and do it. And then the last thing is security safeguards. You must have reasonable safeguards in place to protect the data. It's extremely important that you do that. It's not just about throwing it out there into the wind. Openness, another one of these, is that developments and practices that policies regarding the data should be communicated. Again, it comes back to letting people know open and in a fair manner of what you're doing with the data. And this is where companies get in trouble. I mean, you're always going to have people that are going to say, well, you didn't tell me, right? You're always going to have that. But the more I've learned, the more you communicate with people what you're doing with their information, in most cases, more than not, people are totally understanding and they want you to do that because, again, it benefits them. You want a win-win situation. But it's when people aren't open with the data and trying to hide things, that's when things go awry. You need to have individual participation. Okay, they should be able to determine if an organization has or has not their personal data. In the GDPR requirements, they have the right to be forgotten. You can get rid of their data. If they say they want to not be there anymore, you can get rid of it. Now, the problem is if you're running an organization, the individual can't say, I want all my data purged. Well, you have to have the data to help the individual with their needs. However, the big issue that comes into that is if a person leaves the company, they have the right to say, I want to be forgotten. The last thing is you got to have accountability, and there's fines for this, that you are accountable for ensuring the complying with the other principles. So you got to have some level of audit and compliance that will come around and focus to make sure everybody is doing what they're supposed to be doing around them. Again, it's doing the right thing. If you look at these principles, they're doing the right thing. It's just when you start getting a little bit wonky and you're not being upfront and honest with people is when things go awry. All right, so this is a reference of these. I got Certified Information Security Professional from ISC Squared. There's also Tor Teaches. There was a really good part about that with the CISSP rules and laws. OECD, that was another place that we talked about the last bit of it, and the NIST 818. All right, let's get going on to the next one.